Hi, everybody. Okay, so we are on the April 15th notes section, and just one more reminder that you have that little Windows button that if you just press it once, it does this, like I just did. But if you press it and an arrow at the same time, or press it and then an arrow and hold them both down at the same time, it should do something like this, where you can pull up the document right next to my video. And if you need help doing that, let me know. In the meantime, we're going to talk about the effects of competition all the way through herbivory today. So continuing through on our Prezi, we looked at our barnacles. Effects of competition. So competitive exclusion is what we're going to start out talking about. My phone's vibrating. And competitive exclusion is when two species have overlapping niches. So remember, niche is its role, and they have overlapping roles. And that means one will outcompete the other. So basically, whichever one is stronger is going to survive, and the other one either has to, will either adapt or will die, right? And chances are is that it's going to die. Because remember, adaptations are caused by mutations in your genetics or your DNA. So those are pretty random, right? You can't just go, make a mutation happen. It's got to happen randomly. And so if those mutations don't happen, then the species just dies out, right? So when two species compete, so these are diatoms. These are cool looking things. They almost look like little shells. And my battery's gonna run out if I don't plug in here. Let me grab my charger. Whew, that was a close one. Okay, so these diatoms are little micro, which means they're really, really tiny. And basically, you notice that with this one, this Asterianella alone, it's this dark line here. It survives up to this population point. This Synedra will survive up to this point. But if we put them both together, which one wins? It looks like it's the Synedra, right? And the Asterianella dies out eventually. So which one outcompetes? The Synedra outcompetes the Asterianella. If we look here, another thing that can happen, so competition can also cause resource partitioning. So here's what that means. So we're talking about competition for space here. So competition drives species with overlapping niches to adapt to non-overlapping resource pools. And what that's a fancy way of saying is that competition can drive species to live in other places. So let's say that there were so many of these anoles. So these are called anole lizards. They're really cute. Let's say there were so many that were living on the limbs of trees that some adapted to living on the fence post. Some adapted to living on the ground. Some adapted to living way up in the leaves, right? And they did that because there was so much competition for space here in the middle. So that's called resource partitioning, going to different resources when the ones that you want are, there's a lot of competition for them. Other things, that just zooms in on the picture for us. Character displacement. So this is really cool, and we're actually starting to lean into our next unit here a little bit. So what this is competing populations are more divergent in adaptive characteristics than non-competing populations of the same species. What that means is that populations that compete for resources become more diverse as a species. And so an example of this are finches. So finches, when they first arrived at the Galapagos Island, it was one species of finch with one beak type. So let's say it was this very simple looking beak type here. However, over time, they were competing for food, right? So some evolved to have giant beaks that could crack open really large nuts. while some evolved to have really tiny beaks that could get in between tree bark and get insects. So competition drove these finches to get different beak sizes, different physical characteristics, which is pretty cool. Just zooming in on that. Now let's talk about what else can happen here. So these are some different interactions between species. So we've talked about competition. Remember, that's a negative. Neither species benefits. And now we're going to talk about predation. So predation you've heard of, right? One species, the predator, kills and eats the other species, the prey. So so one species, the predator, kills and eats the other species, the prey. It's a plus minus interaction. So one species benefits, the predator, and one species does not, the prey. And predation actually drives many adaptations as well. So effects of predation. You can get organisms that have different colorations. So just looking at these, before I even read you the definitions, you can see that there is cryptic and aposematic. Now, if you look at these, what does cryptic mean? It means that they're doing what? They're blending in, right? It's camouflage. We've got this toad that's blended in really well. I'm sorry, a tree frog that's blended in really well to the rock. And then we've got this, looks almost like a katydid that looks so similar to leaves. And then we've got this flounder that looks just like the pebbles here. And then aposematic, these ones I can see really easy. Why do they want to be seen so easily? Because they're warning, right? So this snake is poisonous, so it's warning, stay away from me, I will bite you and you will die, right? The skunk, warning, hey, stay away or I will spray you and you will stink for weeks. For these ones over here, this is mimicry. There's two types, but I don't really want to focus on those ones. Mimicry, what does that sound like? Mimicking something else, right? To mimic means to copy. So what this is this is a snake here, right? This is the green parrot snake. This is a caterpillar. It is harmless, but by looking like this snake, it keeps birds from eating it, right? And then there's this cuckoo bee, which looks a lot like a yellow jacket. This bee, harmless. Yellow jacket, I was stung by one of those in the cheek and it hurt like crazy. But basically, one species mimics another in order to appear threatening or give off a warning sign or keep predators away. It's basically a way of fooling a predator. So there you have your difference between the caterpillar and the snake, and then difference between the cuckoo bee and the yellow jacket. Herbivory, right? This is something you should be very familiar with as well. One species, the herbivore, eats part of a producer, plant or algae. So it's a positive negative interaction, right? Who's benefiting from this? Or it's getting a meal. And then who's the minus sign would be the plant or the algae. So producers have evolved many adaptations to control herbivory. So what that means is plants have evolved ways to keep herbivores from eating them or from eating some. So think about that for a second. What plants have you seen in the wild that have ways of keeping you away from them, right? So one that comes to my mind right away would be a cactus, right? Huge spines. I don't want to jack around with that. This one here, these are a certain type, or maybe not. Yeah, they're peas. And it has these hairs on them. And what they noticed is that the more hairs the pea pod had, the less damage that it had. So over time, this population of pea pods is going to have a lot more hairs because the ones that don't have the hairs are the ones who are going to get eaten. So that's just an adaptation that can occur because of herbivory. So I'm going to put that off to the side here. And if you've got all of your notes, then you can feel free to stop the video now. If you want to go, I'm going to go over them with you here really quickly, just so we can make sure we are all on the same page. And so let's go back to competition. So we've got competitive exclusion when two species have overlapping niches one will out-compete the other. And I'm actually going to take this out. You'll answer that in a later date. And then we have resource partitioning. Competition drives species with overlapping niches to adapt to non-overlapping resource pools. So the example of this was those anole lizards, right? It drove them to live somewhere else where their niches were not overlapping. Character displacement. And this one was competing populations are more divergent in adaptive characteristics than non-competing populations of the same species. So populations become more diverse if they have competition to drive those adaptations that make them more diverse. So something's not going to adapt unless it has to, or unless it's being pressured by something else. And so when there is that pressure there to change, to adapt to a situation, then a species is going to show more of that. And then we talked about predation, so that's a positive-negative interaction. One species, the predator, kills and eats another species called the prey. Predation drives many, and that should be adaptations, right? Adaptations seen in coloration. This should be adaptations. I'm writing all sorts of things on while I do this. Adaptations seen in coloration. There's cryptic, right? So that's camouflage. Aposematic is warning, coloration, and then mimicry, the coloration of one species mimics the coloration of another. So that's where you have one species that might mimic the warning color of another species to be like, ooh, I'm poisonous too, and in reality it's not. Herbivory, talking about herbivory. I'm gonna skip ahead right here. So that is one species. The herbivore eats part of a producer. So remember, they're called producers because they produce or make their own food. So that'd be your plant or your algae. Remember, they're the base of our trophic pyramid. They get the most energy. And then producers have evolved many adaptations to control herbivory. And that is it for today. As long as you took these notes, you are good. There's nothing to submit on Teams. Once again, if you have any questions, please reach out to Mrs. Knoll or myself. We really miss you guys, and we really